Growing your business can mean big-time logistical questions like, how are we going to keep up with all these local deliveries? Let Uber Direct offer you a helping hand. With Uber Direct, you take orders on your website, app, or by phone. Then drivers who are part of Uber's courier network pick them up from your store and deliver them to your customer's doorstep. Sounds simple, right? Delivery just got better with Uber Direct. Learn more at uberdirect.com. Why are we seeing so many restaurant chains come back from the dead? Hello, this is Jonathan Mays, Editor-in-Chief of Restaurant Business. Recently, we've seen a number of brands that were dead get brought back to life by investors hoping to tap into consumer nostalgia for the concepts and for their menus. Earlier this year, for instance, the first steak and ale in nearly 20 years opened its doors in a suburb of Minneapolis. A new Souplantation and Sweet Tomatoes opened in Arizona in April after that brand shut its doors and filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in 2020. And now we have plans in California for another old chain, Ground Round. I am here with two of my restaurant business colleagues, Lisa Jennings and Joe Guszkowski, and we are going to talk about why these investors feel the need to do this right now, what's driving the decisions, and whether these brands can live off this nostalgia and for how long. Lisa Jennings, let me start with you. What's the deal with Ground Round?
The Ground Round. So this is a brand that is literally being brought back by a fan. So Joe and Nachi Shea in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, where the brand was born in Massachusetts, actually. So it's not totally out of reach there, but they had fond memories of going to Ground Round as a kid. You know, it was a fun, family-friendly place. This was a brand that was founded in 1969. It was created by Howard Johnson's as a kind of a sister brand to, and Howard Johnson's Hojo's, as we used to call it, was later bought by Marriott, but the Ground Round stayed with the original owner, Imperial Group, which was acquired a few times and has a long history. In 1997, it was owned by Boston Ventures, took on too much debt, fell into default, filed bankruptcy. There was this fateful day in 2004 when it was Valentine's Day, and all of the units closed in the middle of dinner service. I mean, it was just this really dramatic ending. And so it was picked up by franchisees, a co-op. Then it had 71 units. It had grown to like 200, before this, but 71 units at this point. Franchisees tried to keep it going. They tried to reinvent it a few times. So this Joe Shea had actually loved it so much that he had applied to be a franchisee. Guy had never run a restaurant before. Never owned a restaurant before. He had worked for restaurants. And so he applied to become a franchisee and was rejected. He didn't say why. But then after, the co-op, I guess, was starting to, franchise units were just closing. The CFO came to him out of the blue one day and said, you had expressed interest in this brand. Would you like to buy it? And so he didn't say buy for how much, but he worked out a deal where he took on the rights, and now he's reopening Ground Round in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. It's scheduled to open in January, and people are thrilled. And now this is not a brand that I recall. I grew up in the DC area, and I don't know that there was one there. But Joe, I think you remember the Ground Round, right? Do you have nightmares about Bingo?
Yeah. I don't remember the clown, but the Ground Round was in our, growing up, our rotation for going out to eat. And what I remember is you could get a sundae in a little baseball helmet. So I would collect those. I had quite a big collection. And it's no longer there. It's gone.
I would think so, since the brand actually disappeared for a while. I also grew up with Ground Round. That's where we went to when it was a real treat on payday, and we would go there every so often. I don't know. I was young. I had no idea what was great and what wasn't. So, but I definitely have memories of the chain and the concept, and it was something else. But I completely forgot about that Valentine's Day thing, Lisa.
Yeah. And well, it never really fully went away, and that there are actually 4 franchise units still open. So in I think, North Dakota, South Dakota, something like that. But yeah, and those franchisees have become, are franchisees to Joe Shea, who owns the rights. So it's not like it is completely dead, but this is going to be the first new restaurant that's open in quite a while. And it'll be interesting to see how he makes it modern. And this is something that he literally is going back to this brand because he remembers the way it was and wants to recreate what it was for him. But he also has to do this for a modern contemporary audience that largely is not going to know what the Ground Round is. There's a lot of folks out there, younger kids, who have no idea what this brand is. So
no. What they need to do is adopt. They need to adopt the song that we created, my wife and I, created for Ground Round, and I can't even remember what started it, but we replaced the lyrics to "You Spin Me Round" with "We're going to Ground Round." So we're going to Ground Round, baby, Ground Round, to the buffet, baby. Anyway, that's what we would sing all the time. Just my life, my household is just nonstop excitement. All right, let's move on to another. Now, this was an actually dead brand, Steak and Ale. Joe, I heard you know a little bit about this, yeah?
Yeah, so Steak and Ale was kind of the first casual dining steakhouse brand. It was started by Norman Brinker back in the 60s. Kind of known for its distinct atmosphere, very dimly lit, kind of Tudor style interiors with wood and stone and stained glass. And they're known for, a few of their menu items, prime rib, steak, of course. And then they were one of the first chains to do a salad bar. And they grew to, around 300 units. But by 2008, we're struggling, and like Ground Round, all disappeared in one day due to Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Then along comes this guy named Paul Mangiamel, who seems to have sort of an interest in these bygone brands. He ended up buying the brand along with Bennigan's, another Brinker concept that had been in decline, and has invested in them and worked to bring them back. And this is a long time coming. I believe he's been talking about doing this for like over a decade. Finally, this year, the first Steak and Ale reopened in your neck of the woods, Jonathan, Minnesota. So kind of unusual. I mean, it's very unusual to see a brand completely disappear. As Lisa just said, there's still a few Ground Rounds out there. And then to see it come back after such a long time is really unusual. So yeah, that's where Steak and Ale is at. It's making its comeback. He's got plans to do, I think about a dozen more.
Yeah. I actually went to that location. James Walker actually flew into town, and the two of us went with Paul to that particular location. And while I was waiting, I actually saw a couple of people stop in front of the Steak and Ale and take their pictures. And I need to note this. It is the only thing that makes it a steak. I mean, well, the only thing that makes it a Steak and Ale, are some of the design elements inside and some of the menu items. Obviously, the salad bar is there, the bread at the table, the honey wheat bread is at the table. And some of the items from the menu is there. But the location is a complete nondescript restaurant on a hotel in a suburb. Mm-hmm. So it's not the old Tudor style that you remember, but it's a fascinating a change. I mean, it's right off a highway. So you might get, passersby and things like that. It's only got 150 seats, so it's a relatively small location. I mean, it was good. We enjoyed our time there. It was fun. Got the explanation, and and things like that. So it was a completely different one. And, Paul, by the way, told me, I think he first told me like 2013 that he planned to bring back Steak and Ale. And so he's been threatening to do it for a long time. So I have to admit, I didn't actually believe him when news first emerged. I think it was last year that he was actually going to do this. But it was actually fun to go there. I don't have a whole lot of memories of Steak and Ale when it was in its heyday. I mean, I might have been there once or twice, but I definitely had memories of Bennigan's. Lisa, do you remember when that Bennigan's shut down? Do you remember when Bennigan's shut down? That was something, wasn't it?
Which Bennigan's shut down?
When the whole concept shut down.
Yeah,
that was in 2008. That was a notable moment in the history of casual dining.
And it really did sort of, that's what it kind of seemed like it was signifying, that, casual dining as we knew it, from that era was going out the window, which hasn't really been true. I mean, we've certainly seen other brands that aren't doing so well now, but that are carrying on the banner of what casual dining was, from that era. But, Norman Brinker was somebody who really had a huge impact on the industry. He's, when you build those trees of who's influenced whom, a lot of them will come back to Norman Brinker in the end. But I don't know, Joe, you cover casual dining. What do you think? I mean, did that end an era, do you think?
I think it ended a certain era. I mean, I think the sort of link between Steak and Ale and Bennigan's is that they were very outdated at the time, and Steak and Ale especially so. I mean, the whole concept is like sort of a time traveling sort of experience, like you're going back into the Middle Ages in the restaurants. So it was just sort of like these concepts were old, and we were going into a financial crisis, and they didn't survive. I mean, it was a turning point for a lot of casual dining brands, of course. I mean, you look at TGI Fridays, also didn't really ever bounce back from that. But it wasn't necessarily the death of casual dining, period. Obviously, there are other brands, but that made it through. It was that type of restaurant that just hadn't kept up and hadn't kind of evolved as consumers did.
Well, that's where, when does old become nostalgic? I mean, that's the thing, is there's old, and then there's something that really resonates about a brand, that people want to bring back. And that's the art of capturing it.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. I would say, first off, on the Bennigan's thing, that sort of signaled that casual dining was hurting. That, what I look at it, because there's been, plenty of casual dining chains that have done fine since then. But, you look at, just say, TGI Fridays and Ruby Tuesdays, for instance, two other notable members of casual dining history. We talked about this on a previous podcast, Joe. I mean, essentially, TGI Fridays' problems began during the Great Recession, during that era, and it's been in decline ever since. And now we see the current state of that particular brand. Ruby Tuesdays is basically a shell of its former self. It does have a couple hundred units, but I mean, I think it had somewhere, 1,000 locations at one point. It was publicly traded, but that was in decline. Applebee, we see a bunch of companies like Applebee's not quite where it was during its heyday. So, I mean, it sort of signaled the end, that the era of casual dining was over, and it was seeded its way to fast casual, which is where we're at now. But let me talk about the next brand, and then we can talk about full service, because all of these are basically, although this one is not, but a lot of, two of these three brands are basically full service. And that's Souplantation and Sweet Tomatoes. This one is really interesting. The concept was founded in 1978 in San Diego. And frankly, it's one of the weirdest concepts, I think, that we have, because it started off as like a side-by-side brand, and then just sort of grew together over time. grew throughout the Southwest. It was a buffet concept, grew throughout the Southwest, went public in the 1980s, ultimately sold in 2005 to that bastion of restaurant chain excellence, Sun Capital Partners. It filed for bankruptcy in 2016. I know that's probably going to surprise listeners to find out that a Sun Capital concept ultimately filed for bankruptcy, but it did actually happen. It emerged a year later and was owned for a while by sort of this bottom-feeding investor, Cerberus Capital Management. And then a year later, changed hands again, was sold to the family office, Perpetual Capital Partners. But Souplantation and Sweet Tomatoes would not be perpetual because a pandemic would take care of that in 2020. March 2020, the company closed the doors of all 97 of its restaurants. And then by the following May, the company decided to just go Chapter 7 and put an end to the whole thing. And it went out of business. And then we thought, well, that was it. We're done with Souplantation and Sweet Tomatoes, but not for long. Last year, word got out that a Sweet Tomatoes had signed a lease for a location in Tucson, Arizona. They had bought the rights to the brand name and have sent, and in April of this year, opened a location in Tucson. Lisa, you love Souplantation and Sweet Tomatoes. I'm pretty sure you're a fan.
I love Souplantation. I'm in California, so I mean that was the place you could take your kids, and no matter how picky eaters they were, everybody could get something they wanted. I mean, it was a lot more than salad. It had a huge salad bar, which is what I liked, but it had all manner of breads and pastries and pasta and pizza and self-serve ice cream, soft serve ice cream that they could build their own sundaes. And, it had it all. But, when the pandemic came along, very quickly, everybody said, oh, no more buffets. We can't do buffets. That's, you can't do that in a pandemic. And it just completely shut down. I mean, it had spent years trying to keep it going. But, it was known as Souplantation in California and Sweet Tomatoes outside California for reasons that were never fully explained. It had to do with plantation aspect of it being unpleasant outside. I don't know why it worked in California, but anyway, it started as Souplantation. And so this group came along and bought and recreated it in Tucson in a unit that had a building that had been a Sweet Tomato. So this was really a return of that specific restaurant. And the people drove apparently from all over the region, from California, to go for the opening when it opened in April. I mean, people really miss this brand, and it has a huge following on social media. There are petitions to try to get Sweet Potatoes to come to San Diego, for example. There's a big move to try to get it back there. There's a copycat out here in LA. I think it's called Salad and Fresh or something like that. That's exactly like it, but not a Sweet Tomatoes. That's reopened and apparently is getting a lot of attention. Soup and Fresh, it's called here. It's in Rancho Cucamonga. People loved this brand, and it's being revived with the same recipes. People say it smells the same, it has the same feeling when you walk into it. The branding is all the same, and the big question is, are they going to do more? And the guy, the contact who at the time I interviewed was the COO. His name was Mike Malone. I reached out to him this morning to see how it's going, to see whether or not they've made decisions about opening more. He's no longer with the company. So I can't tell you who's running it now or what happened, if it got sold, but trying to find out more about that.
Mm-hmm.
And the big question is, will they do more?
I mean, we could talk a little bit a minute. I mean, there's the issue, I think, with soup. I mean, there's two issues. First off, I mean, have one brand name, guys. I mean, let's ditch the whole idea. I mean, Sweet Tomatoes was just a fine brand, and I don't know why you need to have two different brand names. It made no sense from the get-go. But whatever.
Because Souplantation is a terrible.
Well, it's a terrible name. It's an absolutely terrible name, and just go with Sweet Tomatoes. Great brand name. That's exactly what I would have done. But in any event, I mean, in any brands out there with two brand names, too chicken to get rid of one of them because you think it just, then don't do it in the first. It doesn't make any sense anyway. But the other, the other issue I think with these guys, they pulled the plug real fast in May of 2020. And they looked out in the future and they're like, buffet's dead. Buffet's not dead, by the way. Golden Corral's doing perfectly fine. There are plenty of buffet concepts out there. It was a brutal 2020 for them for sure. They could have taken some steps to deal with it, and obviously the company didn't want to put any money into it. The commonality in all three of these situations really is that they were owned by companies that didn't really operate them, with any sort of long-term growth in behind it, didn't really invest enough into the brands, and or over levered it, which was a very common situation. And then then the leverage comes back to bite them, and things like that. And then they fail and then go out of business, even though they have a certain customer base that wants them. I mean, look, Steak and Ale has, much like Sweet Tomatoes, has a fan base that really wanted to go. I mean, I watched people taking their dang picture in front of the restaurant myself. So I guess the question is that I have, and Joe, I'm going to ask you this: how long can these brands live on this nostalgia? I mean, that's what they're planning to do. How long can they do this?
I don't think the nostalgia is going to get them very far. I mean, the whole essence of nostalgia is that you look back and you remember these things so fondly, and it's usually not the reality. I mean, people might think that they really miss going to Steak and Ale. They might come back and revisit it, and it doesn't sound like it's probably going to scratch the same itch, at least this first location in a hotel. So, I think it maybe will get them through this first kind of grand opening period where people are curious and will want to see how it compares. Beyond that, they're going to really have to evolve and kind of catch up with the times. I don't know, people my age aren't going to have any interest in going to Steak and Ale because we don't remember it. So what's in it for me? What's on the menu that's special, that's going to get me to come back? So I get the whole idea of this being kind of like a beloved legacy brand with a small and engaged group of people, but for it to really succeed, it's going to have to kind of reinvent itself. And it sounds like, it's trying to do that, but I don't know if it's really got legs.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to go back, like in Steak and Ales in particular. I mean, you're really going back 17 years at least. You go back 17 years for when it filed for bankruptcy in 2008. And so you got to say that it's been 25 plus years since really the brand was, this, not struggling, decent restaurant chain. 25 years. So you got nobody younger than 25 really has any decent memory of the concept. The same probably goes for Ground Round. Sweet Tomato is a little bit different, but still, that filed for bankruptcy in 2016. So customers might have liked it, but they didn't like it that much because the company filed for bankruptcy in 2016.
There's a reason.
There's a reason
There's a reason these brands went away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
There is.
The economic changes also. I mean, it's one thing to think about what the consumer thinks about you, but for Sweet Tomatoes, for example, I mean, I don't know if you remember them, but these were huge, buffets, and there was so much product out. And I just can't imagine how in today's environment you could have, the food costs of something like that work and not charge $25 a plate. I mean, I don't know how I think I remember it being something around $12 or something like that to get, a plate, a big serve yourself, fill it, eat everything kind of thing. So I don't know how that could work in today's economics personally, but so whatever comes back, it has to be something more streamlined than it was, I would imagine. And I think that's, so these brands have to deal with the realities of today's economic climate.
Right. Yeah. And it's also worth pointing out that though the buffets, I know I said earlier that in theory, these guys just shut the door too quickly. That said, a number of buffet brands have actually completely gone out of business. Like the entire the entire former buffets, Hometown Buffet, Old Country Buffet, Ryan's, they're all gone. So the economics are tough. Now, that said, if we want to get into what happened to the buffet brands, that's an entirely new podcast, because, I will maintain that those buffet brands were destroyed and not, really encouraged. I mean, so if there's any hope in any of these brands, is that they have people behind them that are willing to invest in the concepts and put some money behind their growth and their development. The best thing that I'd heard when I was getting that presentation on Steak and Ale, Joe, is that the concept was changed and altered and evolved to fit a different unit economics. That, part of the reason it was in a hotel is the location was available and they could do it relatively cheaply, and, future locations are not going to have that old Tudor style at all. They'd probably be standalone and larger, but they're going to be second generation sites, things of that nature, so they did evolve it to match a more modern reality. But then again, the simple fact of the matter is consumers are not eating out at full service chain restaurants that much anymore. So they do have an absolute uphill battle that they have to get past the nostalgia thing and have a concept that people actually want to go to.
I think, that's the other thing besides the economic backdrop being different, is the consumer backdrop has changed so radically since these brands last were operating. I mean, it's not unusual now for a full service restaurant to have 25% of its sales be for delivery and takeout. So they have to adapt to that as well. That completely transforms the business model.
Yeah. One last point I want to make. We always call zombies, by the way. We always call zombies restaurant chains that have that aren't getting any investment and then are just slowly declining and they're not growing anymore, things like that. Concepts like, anything owned by MTY Food Group out of Canada, for instance, things like that. But now you wonder if we've got to change the definition, because an actual zombie is something that comes back from the dead. Now we got all of these nostalgia-based zombie concepts, emerging from certain death. So that's what I'd say. We got to change the name of zombie concept. So
Lazarus.
Lazarus concepts. Well, we'll see. Nothing like the investment Jesus coming to raise concepts from the dead. All right. That is enough. That is enough of sacrilegion for me. Joe and Lisa, thank you very much for joining me this week on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And that should do it for this week's episode of A Deeper Dive, which was edited, as always, by Spoons. Artwork by Nico Hines. You may find this and other episodes of the podcast on our website at www.restaurantbusinessonline.com/article/deeper-dive. And you may subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I'm Jonathan Mays, your host, podcast producer, and the editor-in-chief of Restaurant Business. Thank you for listening. Growing your business can mean big-time logistical questions like, how are we going to keep up with all these local deliveries? Let Uber Direct offer you a helping hand. With Uber Direct, you take orders on your website, app, or by phone. Then drivers who are part of Uber's courier network pick them up from your store and deliver them to your customer's doorstep. Sounds simple, right? Delivery just got better with Uber Direct. Learn more at uberdirect.com.